Hello, everybody. I'm John Casesa. I'm an investment banker at Guggenheim Partners, and we're here to have a conversation with Bill Ford today. I'm going to start right in. I don't know if everybody knows you're executive chairman of Ford Motor Company. You've been the CEO of the company. You've been on the board. What's an executive chairman do, and what's your role at Ford now?
It's funny. I think I kind of coined the term executive chairman, and now I see people are using it all over the place. And what happened was, so when I hired Alan Mulally, and one of the things that I talked to my board about prior to hiring Alan was I was chairman, I was CEO, I was president, and I was COO. Yeah. And that was too much. And so when I went to hire Alan, I said, look, I really need to get some help here. And they said, well, who are you looking for? What kind of COO? I said, I don't care. I've got to get the right person. Titles don't matter. So when I found Alan, someone of his caliber, obviously, wanted and should have been CEO. But having been non-executive chairman in '99, I didn't want to go back to that because I felt that wasn't the right role. And I also felt Alan was going to need help along the way. So I coined the term executive chairman, which no one really was sure what it meant, to connote that I was going to be there every day working with Alan as we worked our way through the difficult times. And so today, I focus a lot of my time on strategy, on the future of technology, and on how all of that is going to dramatically change our industry and particularly our company.
So I'm going to come back to technology and the change in the car business, but when we met many years ago, many product cycles ago, you were a young guy with a bit of an environmentalist agenda, which in Detroit at that time, I don't think was, there weren't that many environmentalists.
No, I was a Bolshevik, for sure.
So how did you reconcile that being in the car business? Because it was just not a mainstream topic.
No, it wasn't. And it was, in fact, when I left Princeton, I joined Ford in '79. I really wrestled with that whole decision because, I really did have this environmental ethic, and I saw the way our industry was going, and it really troubled me. And it troubled me for a number of reasons. One is I just thought that, the rest of the world was moving on, and our industry had its head in the sand. I also never wanted us to be like the tobacco industry, where we wouldn't have the best and the brightest want to come work for us, and also that our employees, I never wanted them to have to apologize to their family and friends for working for an industrial company. And I thought that there was a whole generation, including mine, that was about to come through that had a very different environmental ethic than the prior generation. So you're right, it wasn't well received. In fact, when I joined the board, and I was in my late 20s, I was told I had to stop associating with any known or suspected environmentalists. But really, it's interesting. So I think back on those days, John, and you and I have known each other. By the way, we were just chatting. I've known John for a long, long time. We don't have, the whole analyst industry has changed dramatically. And we used to have really thoughtful, long-term analysts like John who covered our industry. And because, things have changed, Sarbanes-Oxley and everything else, the whole analyst industry has changed. And it's great to actually talk to you again and somebody who knows our industry as deeply, certainly as I do. But anyway, that's just an aside. So,
of course, I went to the dark side.
Well, you did.
Investment banker.
You did.
Yeah.
But you actually are very helpful to many of us in the industry today as we figure out our long-term strategy. But so I would say this: if you were an environmentalist years ago, it was an inherently negative proposition because all you could be was against things. There were no solutions. And so if you think of those days, you were always asking people to give up something, do less, trade off. And often the trade-offs were things that people weren't willing to make. And as it pertained to cars, if you really wanted to be, in the 70s and 80s an environmentalist, it meant you were driving a manual transmission, underpowered, force, with manual window cranks and AM radio. And that was about it. And of course, most people didn't want that. They wanted their neighbors to do that, but they wanted to drive what they wanted to drive. And so it really wasn't until, probably the last 6 or 7 years where technology has enabled us to bring to customers vehicles that are environmentally responsible and you don't give up other things. So it's gone from being a very negative proposition, I think, to a very hopeful one.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about the era we're in now, where now it's tastes great and less filling, right? Where you can have your cake and eat it too. And if we can go to slide 3, there's a picture of a bunch of Ford cars, and I notice in Los Angeles, especially, we're seeing a lot of Teslas, and my friends always talk to me about the electric car. What do you think of the solutions now? If we're not asking people to give up like we did in the 70s, what are we doing now?
Well, it's interesting. Your slide says the power of choice, and that's what we call it, because we've electrified our mainstream products, unlike some of our competitors. So we've electrified the Focus, we've electrified the Fusion, either with pure electric or plug-in electric or hybrid, in some cases all 3.
So you haven't created a separate electric car. You've taken your mainstream cars you're making now as gas cars and make them electric.
And the reason we did that, John, was we felt we weren't smart enough to know exactly when the demand was going to hit for any one of those, but we wanted to be there for the customer. So when they told us, we really want the plug-in, we like the all-electric, or we like the conventional hybrid, we could flex our production, because they all go down the same line. And therefore, we could flex our production up or down based upon true customer demand, because so much of the customer pull for these products depends on things outside of our control. Price of gasoline, ubiquity of plug-ins, which we don't have yet.
Price of batteries,
all that. So we've placed a big bet on electrification, but we've done it in a way that doesn't handcuff us to a specific technology. Put another way, if we developed a separate standalone platform that was just an electric vehicle.
Chevrolet Volt, for example.
Well, we would then be playing the same old game that we'd never want to play again, which is, if the vehicle doesn't sell, now you've got to discount it, and now you're wrecking the resale value, or you shut down the production line and you've got your fixed costs eating you alive because you have a plant sitting there with no production. That's why we thought that electrifying our mainstream products from a business standpoint and from a customer standpoint made a lot more sense.
And so, but you're selling a lot of cars with EcoBoost. And that's a big part of the economic equation for Ford, because it's huge volume. And what is that? I mean,
basically, EcoBoost is a technology that really, at its very basic level, has been around a long time. It's direct injection turbocharging. But what we've done is we've refined it to the point where in prior years, if you wanted an 8-cylinder, let's take the F-Series, a perfect example. The typical F-Series buyer used to say, give me the biggest V8 you've got, and the bigger the better. Of course, it's a work truck, and as a work truck, it's a cost, and cost in fuel economy was killing them.
Excuse me, do people in Los Angeles know what an F-Series is? It's a pickup truck that used to be used on...
That's a very good point.
And it looks like it's got a bed in the back and you sit in the front.
Well, we took this new technology and we put it across all of our engines, and what it allows you to do is to get the fuel economy of a 6-cylinder with the power of an 8. And then we've done the same thing with the 4-cylinder engines, where you used to get a 6, you now get a 4. It's been very popular with customers, but the real litmus test for us was with the big truck buyers, because we thought this was going to be a big leap of faith, asking them to take a V6 and promising them that it would perform just like their V8 used to. Well, it's done just that, and the take rate has been huge.
And so, on the one hand, you have this discussion about pushing the envelope with electric vehicles and fuel cells someday, but it sounds like the reality, to meet the needs of American consumers at least, is to go from an 8-cylinder to a 6-cylinder to a 4-cylinder. You sell some 3-cylinder cars now, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think the lesson in all this is one size doesn't fit all yet, and may not. But we are entering into a world there. It's interesting. If we go back to the dark days of Ford, I try not to think about those that often, but because I never want to live through that again. But in the 07, 08, 09 time frame, actually the first time I interviewed Alan Mulally at my house, and I was thinking about hiring Alan, one of the conversations we had was, he said, well, why are you interested in me? And I said, well, we have a giant restructuring ahead of us. And I said, I don't think the rest of our industry understands that yet, but I believe it. And I need somebody who has restructured a major industrial company at scale with unions. And frankly, it was a pretty short list when you start to describe it that way. So then we started talking about how that might go. And he said to me, well, could you do it? I said, no, I've never done it at that level. I've done it at a much lower, smaller level, but I need somebody who's done it at, at really globally. And the other thing is, but I said, Alan, there's no point in us doing this if we come out at the end of the tunnel and there is no light. And he said, what do you mean? I said, we have a chance to really remake the Ford Motor Company in a way that we were going to be really excited about in 10, 20 years. But we need to use this crisis to do it. And he got it immediately, and he said, I agree with you. So we placed two big bets back in the dark days, which are paying off for us now. One was we said, well, if back then, the number one reason people rejected Ford, when we did all the research, the number one rejector reason was fuel economy. So we said, well, what if we decided we want to be the fuel economy leader in every segment that we participated in, which was a huge departure from the reality of where we were.
Sure.
But then the other bet we made, which kind of followed along the first one, because they said in order to do that, we probably have to be the technology leader in the auto industry. Again, something that Ford wasn't necessarily known for. But we said not just as it pertains to engines, but also infotainment, mapping, safety. We want to be the leader in that. So we doubled down at a time when a lot of our competition, not just our domestic, including our overseas competition, was cutting back their product programs. We actually, during the darkest days, reinvested more money and pulled ahead our product programs and really invested hard in engine technology and in technology broadly, because we believe that, that if we got through the dark days, that this is something that would be very appealing, because we took a point of view back then in '06 that oil was going to, over time, not be cheaper, not be easier to find, and probably not be in politically more stable parts of the world. And therefore, if we believed that, and it was also a huge weakness for Ford, could we turn that into an inherent strength? Now, the interesting thing is we've done it largely, but perceptions take a long time to change. So, and we were cognizant of that. We said we're going to get there in reality before that starts to sink into people's minds, but it's slowly happening now. So it's interesting that, but so where do we go from here on fuel? The short answer is we don't know. We don't have an energy policy in this country, and we desperately need one.
We basically just, we tell people, we have CAFE, Corporate Average Fuel Economy, and we sort of tell people you have to make a certain number of cars that average a certain level of fuel economy, right?
Right.
To prescribe that.
But the problem is, we don't know which road to go down to get there, and I'll touch on that in a second. But there is the purist argument saying we don't want to pick winners and losers as a country. I actually don't think we can afford not to. And the reason is, in most countries that we do business, I think we're in 144 countries around the world. Number one, they very much value their manufacturing base, which I think is something we'll touch on later. Yep. But also, they very much have policies that drive consumer behavior and society's desires together. Good example of that is years ago in the EU, when we decided to come down the CO2 glide path. All the players sat around a table. You had the automakers, you had the NGOs, and you had the governments, and everybody played their part. And at the time, remember, this is 10 years ago, we chose diesel because that was at the time, the most advanced way. So what happened? Well, we all agreed on a CO2 number. We then, the autos, started gearing up our small diesel production. But the government did a very important thing that helped align customer behavior. They gave great tax breaks to diesel, and they also taxed the heck out of petrol, so that when a customer came into the filling station, it was a no-brainer. Of course I want the diesel. We haven't had that in this country. I mean, I've talked about a gas tax for 10 years, but there's no political will 10 years ago, and there isn't today to get it done. But unless you have price signaling, you're going to have sloppy behavior in terms of customer, because it'll very much vary with the price of oil. So what are we doing about it? Well, we are investing heavily in electric. We're investing still in ethanol, butanol, other biofuels.
Right.
We're investing in hydrogen, both internal combustion and fuel cells, because really we don't know which way this is all going to break. Electric makes a lot of sense, But until the infrastructure in this country is built out, it was an interesting conversation we had, 5 or 6 years ago. I think, many in the government and the NGO community felt like, well, you guys are going to be laggards. Well, here we are as an industry, and here we are at Ford with electrification. But the infrastructure, the smart grid that we've been talking about for 10 years hasn't happened. The ubiquity of plug-ins, which will really enable this to go, hasn't happened. I mean, until you can plug in at work, at the mall, at the restaurant, there's going to be reticence to adopt this new technology. And so and that's something we can't control. And my fear is we and others are out there with all this cool, new, great technology, but it'll be constrained by the infrastructure.
In our policy, to the extent there is one, is the whole, I guess, opposition to a gas tax is it's regressive, it's politically unpalatable. We rather sort of ask producers through CAFE sort of burden the industry to come to some kind of solution rather than ask people to make a trade-off as consumers.
But you're still making them make those trade-offs because the costs ultimately of CAFE get rolled through to the customers. So, I'm not sure that the regressiveness of the gas tax doesn't translate right over to that.
Sure. So can I go back to the dark days for just a minute, if it won't make you
Sure.
squirm? Because people always said to me, gee, you cover the auto industry. Why did it happen like it happened in Detroit? And I wonder if you just talk about, not Ford specifically, you can get into Ford, but why did the industry wind up where it was?
Well, I think it was many years of building overcapacity, many years of union contracts, which, by the way, I don't blame the union for. I blame us. They asked for it. We gave it to them. I mean, so I've had people say to me, gee, aren't you disappointed with the union? How do you operate with the UAW? Right. The short answer is, first of all, I don't think of them as the UAW. I think of them as Ford employees, and they're part of our family. And second of all, yeah, the contracts got out of whack, but all they did was ask. We gave it to them. So there was a lot of bad behavior, I think, for a lot of years in our industry, both on the contract side, but also on the overcapacity side. There was tremendous overcapacity, and it was being masked during the 03, 04, 05 timeframe by very high industry volumes. And it was interesting. I went to my board at the end of 05, and I was CEO at the time. I'd taken over at 02, and we had just come off of 3 very profitable years. And 05 was a very profitable year. And I said to my board, that's when I said I need help. And they said, what do you mean you need help? Everything's going well. I said, no, I think we've got a big crash coming. And they said, well, why? I said, several reasons. One is the industry is running at almost all-time high record volumes, and yet all of our margins are shrinking. That, to me, is terrifying, because when the music stops, it's going to come crashing down. Secondly, the U.S. consumer was getting tapped out. Every day you'd pick up an article and say that the customers are maxed out on credit cards and, blah, 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 blah. The combination of those two coming at us terrified me. And so, that's when I went to the board and said, we got to get ready for a major, major restructuring. I think the other companies felt that it either wasn't going to be quite as severe or that they had already done their restructuring. I went to some industry meetings where right before I hired Alan, I did a big borrowing. In fact, I borrowed $23 billion and had to mortgage our family name, which was
literally, the collateral, the trademark and Ford trademark.
Yeah. You can imagine the family meeting I had shortly thereafter, where I had to explain to my family that I just mortgaged everything, including our name. But they were great. The family was great through it. But it was interesting because I went to a meeting right shortly thereafter where some of my counterparts from the other companies were laughing. I said, well, what's so funny? And they said, we think you're out of your mind for borrowing all that money. And
one of your counterparts had paid down their credit line about that time because they were so confident.
Exactly. And they said, we think you're nuts. I said, well, yeah, probably. But why? And they said, well, because we think everything's fine. I said, well, I don't, and I'm very worried about where things are headed. And they said, oh, well, we've already taken care of all that. We've done all restructuring. We're well positioned. And I kind of shrugged because we benchmark everybody. And by the way, it wasn't just our domestic competition. I mean, this was also true of the transplants, that they had overcapacity. I mean, they were suffering from a lot of the same maladies and ultimately went through a lot of the same problems that certainly GM and Chrysler went through, and even ourselves. But I think, so to answer your original question, this was all setting up over a period of years to create a perfect storm, and it was masked by the fact that we were running at very high volumes.
And that was partly, if I understand you correctly, so you're locked into these contracts, and so it's hard to close plants. You got to employ people. That drives the capacity, and sort of one leads to another.
Yeah, and and the other thing is we didn't have what we now call flexible manufacturing. So we had one vehicle for one plant, and if that vehicle wasn't selling, then you had to do very artificial things to stimulate that demand, all of which were injurious to our brand and to our customer. You either had to put huge incentives out there, which killed the residual values, but if you didn't do that, you were having to eat this enormous fixed cost. So, fortunately, we're in a very different place in terms of, we don't need nearly as much bricks and mortar today to make vehicles. We can send multiple cars down the same line, so if something is selling and something else isn't, that's okay, we just flex up or down. But it was all that was building back then. And of course, the one thing we didn't know, so anyway, we went ahead and did this big borrowing. We did not know, of course, that the credit markets then would freeze completely shut. Yeah. Don LeClaire was our CFO at the time, and Don came to me and said, look, if you're thinking about doing it, let's do it now. It seems to be a pretty benign time. And so we did, and we borrowed everything. I mean, as you know, we borrowed literally every penny we possibly could. But we really didn't have any way knowing that a year later it would be impossible to borrow anything.
And maybe totally different story.
Exactly.
So if I can go to chart 1, here's a chart of your company's pre-tax earnings. So huge loss in 08 and then a recovery. And just to give you a sense of this, in those, the company earning $7, $8, $9 billion a year now. In the North American business is earning margins that are 10, 11%, which would translate into a very high return on equity. I mean, Ford's core business is profitable as some tech companies. And this begs the question then, people ask me, and you must think about, so you've had another big cyclical recovery. Is the company really changed? Because historically, it's just true in the car business, people downsize in a crisis. They fire people, they have less plants. But it's sort of the same companies. Volume comes up, they come back, they make money, and costs creep in. And that's what investors ask all the time.
No question.
So do you think that it's different this time?
Well, look, there's no way I can say yes until we prove it. But I'll tell you this, as someone who's been through 4 of those cycles now in my working career, look, we're great when our back's to the wall. We just can't manage prosperity very well.
Right.
And so, and so we see that time and time again. But I think this near-death experience that we had this last time, combined with the culture change in terms of the way we operate now, we're much more transparent, both externally and with each other, than we've ever been before. And also, I actually see that as part of my job, is to be the institutional memory, to make sure we never go back to the ways that got us to where we were in the first place. But you're right, human nature is such that once you get a little breathing room, people say, well, okay, I postponed all this spending during the so it's okay now. I can loosen the purse strings, and we're really resisting that. In fact, we're really running.
Not doing that.
Well, we're really running the company as we did in 08, 09. Now, every expenditure we make, we really question, and so is there a guarantee? No. And of course, the other issue in our industry is, you mentioned North America going beautifully. Well, Europe's a train wreck right now.
Right.
So there's always some part of the world that needs attention and always has been. And but I think the way we'll ameliorate all that in the future is that we've now gone to global platforms, which have driven our costs down dramatically. Also allow us, because John, for all the years you covered us, we were a series of regional companies. We had Ford Europe, Ford North America, Ford South America, Ford Asia. And often they had nothing to do with each other. We had, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 different C-class cars.
Like an Escort or a Focus.
Yeah, each individually developed, around the world with 4 times the cost and yet much less sales volume because you're only selling regionally. One of the things we also did during this really horrible period was we smashed our, that's probably the right word too, smashed our global product development together. We've been talking about it for 20 years. We finally just made it happen. And what that does is it allows you to drive your costs down. It also allows you to get much fresher product to market much quicker. So we went from being one of the slowest to have a new product to market to being the quickest. And we now have the freshest showroom of any manufacturer around the world. And that's something we're going to continue down that road, because you can get pricing for new vehicles. Anyway, so that's one way I think will prevent sliding back, is that we've really fundamentally cut our cost structure in the core of our business.
Structural
product,
yeah.
Both in the manufacturing side and also on the product development side.
Now, my impression is one of the things that you have been doing aggressively is lightweighting vehicles, and because you can go to electric, you can do a lot of things, but cars have got to be lighter, right? That's
Sure.
critical. And I wanted to just bring up a slide of, we're not going to do a lot of Ford product advertising here, but I did want to put up slide 2, because you remember we talked about what a pickup truck was. There's a pickup truck, and that is your, I think, largest single nameplate.
The F-Series. Yep.
So can you tell us a little bit about this product, which is a concept at this stage, and without giving anyone any secrets?
Really understated, isn't it? Yeah, well, this was a concept we showed at the Detroit show, and it really, what's interesting about this, though, if you go back to what I just said a minute ago about being environmentalists, and in the old days it meant there were enormous trade-offs, I think what this vehicle tries to do is to show you don't have to make those, because this will be class-leading in fuel economy, and yet it will lead in all of the toughness attributes too. And one of the things that's interesting about this is they're actually moving sheet metal parts. So you'll have louvers that close over the wheel openings, louvers that close over the grille for aerodynamics. You'll have a drop-down chin spoiler when you get to a certain speed that will help with all those things. We put on this vehicle to show that there are lots of different ways now that you can address this toughness, towing, payload, fuel economy issue that used to all be diametrically opposing each other.
Right.
But lightweighting materials, obviously, you mentioned, is something that we're working hard on, and on all our vehicles, because ultimately that's something we just simply have to do. And of course, anytime you do that, you've got to make sure that you really haven't traded off anything in terms of safety. But one of the things we're finding is often some of the lighter weight materials are actually stronger than some of the conventional materials we've been using in the past.
And so you can have more aluminum, and you can have smaller engines, and one thing leads to another. That's you get better fuel.
Exactly. Yep.
So I want to now sort of leap into the future, and if I could put up slide 6. So here's a guy reading the newspaper and drinking coffee.
Yep.
And he's probably
a lot of people,
texting too.
A lot of people do that today. They're not self-driving.
Right. Yes. So the idea of a self-driving car, an autonomously guided vehicle, it's been talked about for years. It's a hot topic in the industry now. How realistic is that? Is it a clue to the future? Is it some fantasy that we're sort of...
No, it's not a fantasy. In fact, a lot of the elements of that we're already starting to put into our vehicles. So, some of the self-parking features, are seen going into vehicles today. We also, have adaptive cruise control today, which allows you to put your cruise control on and it'll keep the same distance with the car in front of you. So some of the early elements of autonomous driving are actually coming in today. Many more will be coming in the next 5 years. So you won't wake up one day and find we have an autonomous car overnight. You'll see the elements of it start to come in, but ultimately, will we get there? Yeah, we will. There's no question. I think the question then becomes one of, when you contemplate that happening, you have to be extremely sure that under any conditions, including, satellite outages, whiteout driving condition, rainstorms, all the different things that could throw off a system, that a car can handle that and safely hand back control to the driver. And if that happens, what does that mean? What's the notification period? Because if the driver is truly on email, come on,
right.
Right. So I think those are the kind of later stage kind of things that are going to be tough to deal with at the end. But I'm quite confident that they will be dealt with. But I do know that we'll see a lot of the features leading up to that creep into our vehicles in a way that will be very user-friendly. And so I'm very excited about the technology. And we've opened a Silicon Valley office. Ford has.
Right.
I have my own VC that I started that aims at mobility, because a lot of the startups that are coming into this space are fascinating. May not be appropriate for a company like Ford to get involved with, but nonetheless, I think are very much worthy of getting encouraged and grown and stuff. So I think our world is changing dramatically. But I often think of it, our company's been around 110 years. And for most of those 110 years, we didn't change very much. I mean, if you look back to my great-grandfather's first cars, by the way, as an aside, I just bought his very first car the other day, and it's very cool.
Wow.
But anyway, and I've got it on display at our world headquarters. But really, you've had a lot of incremental changes. But you go back, the car still was, internal combustion engine,
right,
on four wheels with a driver and a steering wheel. And okay, you've had lots and lots of evolutions over 100 years.
But that's been the formula.
That's been the formula. But here we stand, I think, at the cusp of a series of revolutions in the powertrain. I mean, are we going to go away from gasoline to another fuel? Certainly with things like autonomous driving, and the car really becoming a rolling group of sensors that you probably remember the concept car that we showed a little while ago that was connected to the cloud.
Sure.
Once that happens, that car could check your blood sugar, your blood pressure, could turn on your lights at your house, could turn down the air conditioning at your cottage. I mean, it could do anything you wanted. That car could do because it was connected to the cloud. Now, and is that coming? Yeah, that's coming. There are privacy issues and all those kinds of things that that will have to be worked through. But my point is that the car as we know it and how it's used in people's lives, I think, is going to change really dramatically, and it's going to change fast.
And so if this is a vision of way out there, it sounds like the next big thing is the connected car and the idea that cars
Absolutely.
will talk to each other into the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that, Bill, just to give people a clue, I mean, that's sort of in the works now.
It is.
In the cars, those features are coming into cars that you're looking at in design studios at Ford today, right?
Yeah, I mean, that technology, we are demoing that technology, both vehicle-to-vehicle communication and vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. We have tests going on around the country, and actually, in some cases around the world with that. And because, I mean, I gave a TED talk a couple years ago about the future of mobility. And for those of you who know the TED conference, you're supposed to talk about something that people haven't thought of before. And that's a fairly daunting proposition, but
I'll never get invited.
I'm not sure I'll get invited back. But one of the things so what I talked about was the future of mobility and the notion that urban mobility, if we did nothing but continue on the path we're on, we'd end up in a term that I coined global gridlock, because today there are 1 billion cars on the road. And about 7 billion people on the planet. But by mid-century, we're going to go to about 9 billion people in the world, and about 4 billion, up to 4 billion cars.
Slide 5.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't know you had a slide on that.
No, that's great.
But
I just made it when you started talking.
But so if that's true, another phenomenon is taking place during this time, and that is the world will be urbanizing more. So we're going to be growing by 2 billion people, and most of those people will be in major cities. And if those of you who travel already know that today's major cities around the world are a nightmare from a transportation standpoint. And so now extrapolate that out into the future. How are we going to move people in an environment that looks like that? And that's going to change, I think, everything for our business. It's going to change the model of individual ownership will change. We're already seeing things like Zipcar and Zipcar-like, and it was interesting. I think a lot of the OEMs were afraid of Zipcar. I thought it was awesome, and I wanted to partner with them immediately. So we're on 279 college campuses with Zipcar, providing focuses and escapes to college students. We just launched our own car sharing in Germany this month, actually. And so those models will develop, but that's not those are just small pieces of the solution. And ultimately, cars are going to have to be part of an integrated network where everything is talking to each other. And when I say everything, I mean buses, subways, bicyclists, pedestrians, private cars, taxis, all in a single network, all optimizing transportation for that city. And what makes it challenging is every city in the world starts with a different set of assets. And every city in the world has a different infrastructure so what works in Mumbai might not work in New York City or Sao Paulo. But yet, every city is going to have to solve this issue. There's some really interesting things going on. There's a city in the Middle East, Masdar, that's being built from scratch. A lot of MIT professors are working on that. The transportation element of that is interesting because there is no above-ground transportation. All of it, you go to these stations and you get into a pod, which moves you around, not like public transport, which moves in a linear fashion, but this moves more like people move, and then it pops you up exactly where you want to go. Now you can do that when you're starting from scratch. If you start, try that in a city like New York, where they already have an existing subway system. So, but it's indicative of the kind of solutions that people are thinking about, and my urging to my company was, if we don't start imagining this future and then actually start trying to help shape this future, we're going to be we're going to be left behind because this future is going to happen with or without us, and we're in a great position to drive it. But we can't be frightened by it, and we can't be frightened by the notion that the old model of 2 cars in every garage isn't going to hold in future cities. They won't have garages, and because they'll be too expensive, and they certainly won't have 2 cars because where are you going to put them? So I sort of like the whole environmental topic that I was on years ago, where I thought unless we got on the right side of it, we would be left behind. I feel that way about this because if we do nothing, then we're going to be in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years selling to suburbanites and rural dwellers. And the whole urban transportation world will have moved on without us. But if we can provide really interesting solutions, I guess I look at it another way. I think any company only exists to serve people and to make people's lives better. And if you're, and I feel like for most of our existence, we did just that. I mean, prior to the Model T, most people never traveled more than 25 miles from home in their entire lifetime. It's amazing. And the Model T really then determined where people could live, where they could play, and where they could work. And then from that came ambulances and fire trucks and school buses and all and then during wartime we geared up for war munitions. And I believe that for most of our corporate lifetime, we did help make people's lives better. But then these clouds started to come over the horizon. First was the environmental one. And I believe in my lifetime we'll solve that. I believe that we will have clean vehicles powered by a clean grid. At least I can promise the vehicle part. I'm not sure if the grid's going to get their act together. But even as we do that, we have to be aware that this other cloud is looming called global gridlock. But I believe that, and I think the solutions will be really difficult because they'll be different around the world. But to me, it's very energizing to getting working on these issues. And I think it's all, again, about making people's lives better.
And still, people must say to you, but you make money by making cars.
We do. And
in a world like Masdar, for example, that would be terrible if people were just in pods. So how do you reconcile what you need to do to pay the bills? And your business very much dependent on how many you make with a world that really doesn't have room for all the cars.
It's not either or. I mean, it's not a static world in which we live. Today we make cars and trucks, and we do a damn good job of it. And we are continuing on down the continuum of making ever more fuel efficient, ever safer, ever more interesting cars. And nothing will sort of deter us from that mission. But I think there also has to be a longer-term recognition that if that's all we ever do, that at some point we're going to slam into the proverbial wall. Because, put another way, I mean, if we don't acknowledge the fact that at least in city centers, the world of transportation is going to change with us or without us, then, and that's why I think you'll see different business models spring up. Car sharing is one of them. We need to participate in that, and we need to understand it. And even in a place like Masdar, where you say there's no obvious, if that's a solution, I'm not sure that's true. We have a lot of domain knowledge about how to move people and how people and what they like to do, how they like to be moved, and what they like to have access to when they do move. So maybe in that case, our solution isn't a hardware solution for that city. Maybe it's a software one. And we just need to be aware that I think any great business has to have a laser focus on the present, but also has to anticipate the future. And that's where I'd like us, and we are. I mean, it's not just where I'd like us to be, that's what we are doing.
So now I think if maybe we open up the,
sure.
the audience, the questions to the audience.
Yeah, it'd be fun.
Yeah. So if anybody has a question, I think you have to go to the mic.
Not you.
Yeah. You have to. There you go.
And if you, it's really hard to see back there. So if you could maybe stand up, would be great.
There's actually no one sitting behind the first couple of rows.
Well, that's good, since I've got my college classmates and my family in these first rows.
Mr. Ford, good morning.
Good morning.
At the Milken Institute, I've heard a couple disturbing thoughts and things since I've been here since Sunday night. One is obesity, two is education, and being a Detroit native and a Michigander, infrastructure to me is one of our gravest concerns. Can you address that?
Yeah, where are you from originally?
Northville,
Do you get back home?
twice a year.
Cool. I mean, Northville's actually, it's interesting. If I can just say a couple words about Michigan. Michigan's went through absolute hell along with the auto industry. Our state has come back really, really nicely, and and everyone's focused on Detroit now, and there are big issues in Detroit. But the state itself is thriving, and I think you'll probably see that when you're back in Northville next. It's lots of new businesses opening up, lots of tech companies moving to Michigan, which we're thrilled about, particularly around our major universities. And so, it's as we've come back, thankfully our state has come back in a big way. And actually, I think we're going to have a budget surplus this year in the state, which is something that we certainly couldn't have anticipated a few years ago. Anyway, so, and one thing we'd love is all the talent from Michigan that is spread out. We'd love for you to come home. And one of the things that I'm working on with our governor is we're going around to different states to talk to people that had a connection. Either they went to one of our universities or grew up there, and try to get them to come back and reinvest in our state. And interesting, a lot of them are doing that. Off topic. What are we doing about infrastructure? Well, from an auto standpoint, we actually have a limited capability to drive the infrastructure solutions. One of the things that I've done is to try and spend time with our politicians, both in Washington and locally in Michigan, to underscore the need for, as we drive for better fuel economy, one of the ways you can really hurt that is lousy roads.
Sure.
And so, you can look at it for a number of ways. A productivity way, you can look at it through a CO2 reduction. I mean, there are a lot of different lenses through which you can look at the infrastructure issue, all of which underscore the need that we need better infrastructure. We do have an initiative in Michigan for better roads now. But, I'm particularly worried about the electrical grid build-out infrastructure because, we at Ford and our competitors have wonderful electric vehicles now available for the public. But the public is really concerned about purchasing them because the infrastructure doesn't exist to really, and this is particularly true for pure electric, where they have range anxiety. The plug-in hybrids are a little bit better because you drive the first, in our case, 21 miles on your electric charge, and then if that is depleted, you switch over to a gasoline engine. And that, so that relieves that anxiety. But still, I think that if you're going to have widespread adoption of electric vehicles, which I think we should have, we need to build that infrastructure out too. So
it's a little bit like the European story in diesel. Like, to make this happen, you have to have the right price signals, you have the right infrastructure, it's public investment is what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next question, please.
This is a bit of a change in topic, but I wanted to talk about the decision you discussed in 2005 and 2006 to borrow all that money to make Ford extremely liquid. it is a decision that made all the difference at the end of the day in the fate of Ford versus the fates of GM and Chrysler. And I was wondering if you could comment on what that was like. You must have been you were swimming upstream against the industry. Were you swimming upstream internally? And what do you think were the factors that allowed you to make a decision that went so against the grain of what was common wisdom?
Well, one of the things that I was, I was very proud of two important constituents during this very difficult time. One was my family, the Ford family, who we have quarterly meetings and we get together, and a lot of them don't work at Ford, and so they were understandably worried. And every day they'd pick up the paper and they'd read, Ford, GM, and Chrysler are all going down the chute, and and yet in the face of all that, they trusted us. They hung together, and they stood behind the borrowing. And the other was my board of directors. My board was fantastic during this period. They basically said, let us help you, use us as a resource. And we spent no time arguing at the board level during even the very worst times. And one of the things that we did as a board was we spent a lot of time wargaming for every possible outcome, including a bankruptcy for our competitors. We didn't know what that would mean for us. We actually thought that maybe that would drive buyers to them, because we thought that they may say, well, all our taxpayer money is into these companies. I guess I should go buy one. In fact, the opposite happened. We were flooded with letters, and I personally was, from sort of middle America, the man in the street, kind of lady in the street, letters saying, I've never bought a Ford. I don't even know what you guys make, but you did things the right way. You borrowed the money and you're paying it back. And I'm a small business owner. No one would ever bail me out, and therefore I'd like to buy a Ford next time. And that was wonderful, but completely we hadn't anticipated that. But it was, so I'd say our board and our family really were two rock solid institutions that allowed me personally, and ultimately Alan and I, to concentrate on fixing the company. And we didn't spend much time worrying about making somebody happy over here, or is this person upset over here, or there's some politics going on that we need. And my sense of it, and I certainly wasn't there, that wasn't necessarily the case with the other companies, John. I mean, you might have a better sense of that than I did.
Well, I think, you borrowed all this money, and you're working with an enormous burden of the debt payments, but you had it, and you could execute your plan, where those guys were a year or two further in, and they were really preoccupied with just trying to get the money. So I think that's right. And ultimately, I mean, I can't help but thinking that you and the family had equity in the business, and this was enormous economic exposure and enormous emotional exposure. That just wasn't true for some of the other companies.
Well, I mean, the one thing about a family business, it's interesting. There's a lot of, the corporate governance you pick up every day, stories about, they don't like dual class stock, don't like, and I understand all that. But it's interesting. I really do think, particularly in times like that, taking the long view and also sticking behind the company so you don't have the management distracted, so that they can go about their job of fixing the company, I think can be a real strength. And also for the employees. I mean, they know that there's not going to be some executive who pulls a golden parachute and gets out of there. That I'm going to be there, and other family members are going to be there through thick and thin, and the worst of times. And I think that's, I think dealers, employees, and a lot of our stakeholders find that is a good thing, that they're not going to be dealing with somebody else tomorrow morning who doesn't really have a stake in the company.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think when I was an analyst, I originally that was my reaction, dual class stock. It doesn't seem like a great thing, and
Yeah, I remember you used to think that.
Right, I know. Yeah. And I've changed my mind.
Oh, that's the first I've heard
question.
of that.
Yeah, and I'll say that for the record, please.
Driving and texting. I've seen some technologies where the proximity of a mobile unit, iPhone or BlackBerry next to the driver would disable it. Is that technology becoming implemented at Ford? Is it something going forward, or is it really more of the environment? Well, you want your neighbor not to drive the car, but yourself, you really want to have that access.
That's a really good point. I mean, texting is a huge problem, as you know. In fact, in many cases, it's worse than drunk driving, and yet, as often as we put up billboards and public service ads and all that, people still do it. We're looking at a lot of different solutions for texting. One is disabling. Another is voice is getting to the point where it's getting better. One of the things we want to make sure we don't do is eliminate one distraction, create another one. And so we're trying to make sure that, for all the technology we're putting into cars, that we can do it in a way that's very driver friendly. And our point of view at Ford is that it's pretty simple. As a driver, your eyes should always be on the road and your hands should be on the wheel. And whatever detracts from that is something that we would like to try and drive behavior back to the eyes on the road, hands on the wheel. So we are looking at various technologies on that to try and eradicate this problem. Because even in places, there are places where it's flat out illegal, and people still do it, as you know.
Next, please.
Coming from Germany, I mean, you mentioned that Europe is a train wreck. Could you comment on the situation over there, and especially long term? Does it really would it be an option to pull out of the market at all?
No, I mean it's we've been through tough times in Europe before, and we've been through we're applying a lot of the lessons we learned in North America to Europe now. We want to be in Europe, and we've got a great brand. We've got great brand equity in Europe, and it has been a great business for us at various points in our history. In fact, there were times in Ford's history where North America was in the tank, and Europe really kept us afloat. But everything I said about North America in 2005, sort of putting off a problem, you can say that's true in spades in Europe. The cost of closing a facility, the social costs are so high that the industry had been putting off closing facilities for many years by and large. All of us. I mean, but again, the music stopped, and now it's apparent to everybody really how tough the problem is. So we're restructuring ourselves in Europe. The good news is, unlike what we went through in North America here, we've got a great product pipeline in Europe. So our products are really well received. And our challenge in managing the business is to not go revert back to old behaviors, which is huge discounting. And we've been pretty good about that, of holding our pricing, holding our value, and being disciplined about not overproducing as we go through the restructuring. But at the end of the day, we will come out of the restructuring. The economies in Europe will get better, and I believe that we will be well positioned when that day comes. And there are some signs that maybe things are starting to stabilize. There's an old saying: things don't start getting better; they stop getting worse. And we saw that here. Every month through 2007 and 2008, it just would get worse each month, and then somewhere in 2009, it kind of did this. It flattened. Didn't get much better, but it flattened. And then we started to actually breathe because we realized, okay, our plan can now bite and work. And then the things started to slowly get better. And there are signs that in Europe that there are some hopeful signs.
So Bill, just in the category of what's changed then with the company, you have a product pipeline in Europe that's strong. In the past, if Europe was in trouble, they would cut their product budget. They wouldn't have product. Are you telling me because now you're at global platforms that you kept things going, so you're delivering to Europe products that you keep making on this sort of global product development?
Exactly. And that's true around the world. So our whole, whether it's China, India, Brazil, I mean, we're having the full weight of our global product now, come to bear. And that's not, not every product fits everywhere. An F-Series doesn't fit into Europe. I mean, the roads...
Or in Los Angeles.
Yeah. It does fit in Los Angeles, actually. I mean, you get outside of city center here, you see quite a few. But the basic point is that we will, from now on, have a full, not just vehicle, but powertrain portfolio for anywhere in the world. And those markets can then pick and choose anything they want off the menu.
I see Bob Gelbart in the front row here, who's former ambassador to Indonesia. And I want to put up slide 8 as we just talk about the world. So this is, this is a number of cars per 1,000 people around the world, car ownership. And so all the way on the left is the United States, 760 cars per 1,000, almost 1 car per person. And way down there, I see Indonesia at 41. Those markets where, China, I guess, roughly has ownership of 1/5 of ours. Indonesia, 15th, I guess. Are those great opportunities for you?
Yeah, they are.
A North American company, and there's just easy. Is that low-hanging fruit?
Well, to a point, yes. I mean, just a little Russia. We've a joint venture in Russia. It's going great guns. We're very happy with how that's going. China, we're growing as fast as we possibly can. Between China and India, we have 7 new plants under construction today. And yet, be mindful of everything I said earlier about the limits of growth. And what used to drive me crazy is you would see projections like that, and then the conclusion was, and when they get to U.S. per capita ownership, yeah, that's going to be great.
My next question.
Well, you are already traveling in Beijing, Shanghai, and in India. I'll pick a city. It's not so much fun. So yes, there's great opportunity in those countries, but there's also opportunity to help refine the infrastructure to allow more efficient growth. And so, we do have big growth plans in India, in China, throughout Asia. I mean, Thailand, we're going great guns. Indonesia it's relatively early days for us, but yes, Indonesia, and as the ambassador knows, has been a tough business place. There's, historically been, corruption and all those kinds of things that. Well, we feel it's a better environment now, and so we are pushing on there as well. There is a lot of growth to be had. I mean, the whole African continent really is sitting there. It's interesting, our experiences in Africa. During the apartheid days, we lost our operation in South Africa, and we had to rebuild it. We had a plant in Egypt. It was nationalized. I mean, we've had a lot of starts and stops over the years in Africa, yet nonetheless, there's a lot of growth to be had. But I think even as we're pursuing this growth, we just need to be mindful of delivering mobility in different ways. Will mean different things to different people depending upon where they live. And what I'd like Ford to do is to service all of those customers, the urban dwellers, the new market developed customers, and also the suburban and urban rural dwellers.
So maybe a really different business model, because it's not as simple as saying.
There will be lots of different models that will spring up around auto ownership, some of which we've seen, some of which we haven't seen yet. And I'd like us to be nimble enough to be able to take advantage of these. I mean, that's one of the things. It was interesting. When I started my own VC, one of the things I looked at was, should Ford have the VC? And one of the things I concluded quickly is that it probably not, because I felt that Ford should be a very nimble adapter of technology, but we shouldn't get wed to any one company because the world changes so fast. And that if we invest in company A, if there's a disruptive company B that comes along in 6 months, but we've got our horse, we've bet on A. So I think our role in technology is to be a very quick adapter.
And that's partly the Silicon Valley lab.
It's part of the Silicon Valley lab. It's part of the reason I spend a ton of time in the Valley personally. And I think that if we can do that, and then, by the way, that's not something that's ever been true of our industry. Our industry typically has not been quick adopters of new technology. And part of it was we used to say, well, technology cycle time doesn't really line up with our product cycle times, and therefore we're going to have to wait 5 years because 5 years in the technology world's a lifetime.
4 iPhones.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So we now are really opening up all our platforms and we're making changes on the fly as new technology comes in, and that's something that's very new to us. It's really fun.
Sure. Next.
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, you are such a key industry for many countries, particularly in the emerging markets. Do you find, as you try to expand in China, is it even close to a level playing field? Do you have, and it's not just growth, it's profits, right? So
yeah.
Most companies, as they expand into these countries, you're competing against SOEs.
Well, we have, each segment is different. In the auto segment, you have to have a 50-50 local partner. We actually have a very good partner. We have 2 good partners there in China. But you know, time will tell how it all plays out. I mean, I think your basic premise is right. But we, so far so good for us. We've had a great experience in China. We have good partners. You know, we made profits in Asia Pacific this last quarter, even with heavy investment going in. And so it's going to be a long, interesting journey. But our eyes are wide open because you know, we know that the potential pitfalls you can get into.
And how do you feel about Mexico?
Feel great about Mexico. We've been there a long time. We've had a really good history in Mexico. We own our own. There you don't have a JV. It is 100% Ford owned. And some of our best plants in the world are in Mexico.
So last question, what do you think of Tesla?
I love their technology. They've done a great job. My hat's off to them. You know, and so I would never denigrate a competitor. I just think that they need to be mindful as they scale that running a car company is different than running a technology company. And some of the mundane pieces like supply-based management and keeping dealerships stocked with parts and all those things, you know, aren't very sexy, but they're very real. And you know, and if they can grow into that, then I think they'll be great.
Well, Bill, I want to thank you, and I want to thank our audience for the great questions.
Thanks.
Enjoyed the
Thank you.
conversation
Thanks,
very much.
John.
Great job.
That's good.